Hey friends, welcome to the Church Planting Podcast. I'm Greg Nettle and I serve as president of Stadia, where we help you start thriving, growing, multiplying churches for the next generation. I'm excited about today's guest. Man, he's a high impact player in the kingdom, Mr. Warren Bird. Warren serves as ECFA's Senior Vice President of Research and Equipping, and he's widely known throughout the United States as one of the leaders when it comes to research, writing, and knowing everything about thriving, growing, multiplying churches. Really great to have Warren Bird with us on this episode of the Church Planting Podcast. So I'm really excited about this because I've got my longtime friend, Warren Bird, on this episode of the Church Planting Podcast. Warren, welcome to the Church Planting Podcast.
Well, I think the world of Stadia and this dialogue in particular, I've been really looking forward to, especially with you, Greg.
Well, thanks, Warren. And I read everything that you've put out for years and years. And most recently, a report that came out that's called The New Faces of Church Planting. Tell us a little bit about that.
It is the largest ever study of church planters, thanks to Stadia and so many other groups who helped us get outward. 2,700 people connected with church planting at some level, almost all of them church planters, in essence, opened the door. And I gave everybody 15 minutes worth of questions, but they were different questions. Like if you said yes to this, then you got taken down a different route of questions. If you said no to that, you got taken down. So I got just this huge amount of feedback. And we put it out in 5 different reports, each on a different theme, one on funding, one on ethnicity, one on pandemic, how did that change things, one on multiplication implications, and one where we compare the implications of church planting versus multi-site campuses, all free at ecfa.org/surveys.
Okay, so all free. Now, wait, let's just clear this up right up. When we talk about who was surveyed, was this all U.S.? Was it global, multi-countries? Who was surveyed?
North America, 92% U.S., 8% Canada. And the Canadians really aligned, to my surprise, they have different financial package in terms of how they do finances, but in so many ways similar to the U.S.
Okay, so Warren, there's a lot of buzz in the church world right now, and there has been for a number of years about multiplication. Kind of what's the real story? How many churches are multiplying? How many people are interested in multiplying? I mean, I think that's really at the baseline.
Okay. To me, this was the most exciting area. That there were lots of areas of I would use different words like sobering on race was both, when we studied that, both sobering and very encouraging. But the multiplication questions were very exciting. First of all, when we asked, to what extent is the desire to create a network of multiplying churches very much part of your vision? Okay, so let me just make sure you hear what that said. And we ask it at 2 levels, when you started and today. And first of all, I was overwhelmed. When they started, 36% of new churches said that's part of our vision from day one. Man, when I planted my first church, my vision, sadly, was to get to the next Sunday and live to tell and not be kicked out of the place that we were renting. And as a result, we didn't multiply. But wait, there's more, as they say. It increased when we said, so if it was very much part of your vision when you started to multiply, how about today when you've had a few sobering months or years planting the church, and it rose from 36% to 43%, said, yes, we want to be part of that multiplying future. Wow, that is a sea change. And then,
Warren, one of the exciting things is, when you and I planted, it really was just kind of a survival kind of thing. But now, I think about all of the Stadia church plants that I know, the ARC church plants that I know, it's kind of multiplications baked right into the DNA of the new church. We have a church up here in Cleveland, Ohio, a Latina church planter reaching the Hispanic community in Cleveland. And right from day one, bivocational, they've already sent out a couple church planters in the first year of their existence, which that wasn't even on my mind when we were church planting. And I'm seeing that a lot more now. So let me ask you this. It's one thing to have it baked into your vision. Did your results actually, when you actually looked at how many are multiplying, is it bearing out in that way as well?
Yeah, that was another pleasant, delightful surprise. We said, so, in your journey, and again, with 2,700 responses, we could slice and dice a lot of ways, one way of which being what year you started. So, those that are 2 years old, those that are 5 years old, those that are 8 years old as a church. But we said, so what have you done in terms of replicating or multiplying? And we gave a whole bunch of check boxes. And I don't want to underestimate the implications. The one that got the most, predictably, is we give money towards a denomination or network like Stadia to help them plant churches. Well, I think that's terrific. Even if that's all you did, because that's saying we are not keeping it all just for ourselves, as needy as our community is, as much opportunity as we may have. We understand that we're part of a kingdom initiative and we want to give beyond that. But we also ask, have you actually reproduced yourself? And 11% of the people who responded. Now, again, this is across all years. Some of them, 12 years old as a church plant, have reproduced themselves at least once. Well, that is just amazing. Have you had a church planting resident? We got yeses at different levels, and the reports bear it all out. But bottom line, you look at it and you say, something is happening here.
Warren, that's really encouraging, because that's just over the last 10 years where multiplication has increased in churches from 6% of the churches multiplying, at least 11%, if not a little bit higher. So I think that's really encouraging for all of us. Let me ask you this. Between the churches that are multiplying and those that aren't giving birth, what are you seeing in the overall health comparatively between the two groups?
Well, lots of things. I'll give just two highlights. One is we asked the question, how many churches do you believe will come out of your church over the next 5 years? And this was one of the few open-ended questions. And I took the two extremes. I took the people who said zero, who wrote in nothing. We're not going to be able to reproduce in the next 5 years, to those who put 10 or more. What? And then I looked at other stats, like when we ask them, so looking at the congregation you have now, how many are new converts, what percentage, versus transfer growth, say, or biological growth, kids. And consistently higher conversion growth among those with higher desire to multiply. Now, is that carrot, which feeds which? All we know is kind of relationship. We don't know cause and effect, but to me, that was fascinating. But let me go a different direction with your question. Before we did the survey, I talked with a bunch of people at Stadia, and then people like Dave Ferguson at Community Christian, who oversees Exponential. And I asked them, help me know, I want to test some things that predict a church's likelihood of multiplication. And I had 12 different standards. And I said, do you do this? Have you done that? And then I divided up the responses between those who have multiplied and those who haven't. And here are the top 3 predictors of churches that multiply. Are you ready? And none of them are rocket science, but you got to do them. Number 1, do you at least annually participate in a group that works towards multiplication? Now, it could be a national thing like Exponential. It could be a regional thing like a Stadia gathering, but are you part of it? In other words, are you hearing preaching on it? Are you Are you sensing that God is up to something in all these other churches doing it, and I need to be part of it? So are you part of a group that is championing multiplication? Number two, do you have goals? Do you have specific goals to say, we believe God is calling us? Have you met, you prayed about it, worked together as a leadership team and said, God willing, this is what we're going to do by this date? Those who have goals were far more likely to actually achieve them. And third, are you as the leader personally developing an apprentice leader at some level? Meaning, I'm developing a board member, a future board member. I'm leading a small group myself and developing a small group leader. I've got a church planting resident at our church. That it could be at any level, but are you personally engaged with apprenticing yourself? The logic being, if the leader's doing it and inevitably talking about it, that's what ripples through the culture and the existence of the ministry.
And none of those are rocket science, but man, they're predictors. And, one of the things in your report that's fascinating is those churches that are multiplying are faster growing. They're, they're more evangelistic. They're more greater community impact. You just go down the list.
Yeah.
And that's why multiplication, it has these ripple effects throughout your church and around the world. Now, when Stadia started, it started, it was just kind of launch large church. And over the years, we call it multimodality, where you have bivocational planting and house churches and digital and phygital. But one of the things Stadia invested in really pretty heavily in research and development, gosh, Warren, this goes back to about 15 years ago, was the missional movement. And you actually came to River Tree, where I was the senior pastor at the time, and interviewed me and my colleague, Alex Absalom, about what River Tree was doing. But a lot of people thought missional would just be a flash in the pan and then it would be gone. And I argued, no, I think this is going to have long-term effects. What did you see when it comes to missionality in these new studies?
So we gave 25 words and we said, check as many as possible for what you regularly use to describe your approach to doing church. And missional was number one. I was very encouraged that either multi-ethnic or multiracial was number two. And
yes.
Again, you can look at the reports and see, I give you a nice little chart and the percentages and all that. But wow, missional is not a flash in the pan. Now, missional may mean different things to
yes.
different people.
Yes.
But I so appreciate you alluding to the launch large and multiple modalities. We really tried to fish for that in our church, in our survey. And yes, I'm going to make two statements. One is, I want to validate launch large because it consistently showed, from momentum to finances to a whole lot of pieces, that launch large has very positive benefits, not guaranteed, but more likelihood of good things happening. At the same time, there are a bunch of Edisons out there trying to discover the new light bulb and experimenting with all kinds of varieties, some not by choice, like bivocational. Hey, I don't have any funding, so I'm going to do this working from Starbucks and let's see what God does. To a very intentionality, microchurch, underground church, all the phrases that you use, people are exploring. That was very difficult to tally because there are so many varieties out there. I'm just acknowledging that they are there, validating them, and affirming that there is fruit in them. But the final statement on this is, lest you hear this interview and think, well, Greg eventually led what became a megachurch, and Warren just talked about launch large. No, actually, the typical church plant that is planted and growing starts with 2 digits and takes a while. It's not leapfrog growth. It is slow, gradual growth. A rarely straight line, more like a saw, turned sideways where it's jagged. A surge at Easter, a surge at a summer event. We do a surge here, and the ebb and flow, but an ongoing, steady growth of evangelism and discipleship, and resulting in people and funding and momentum.
Okay. So I think we have to acknowledge my heroes these days are bivocational, co-vocational planters. I mean, I'm watching them all over the United States, and it's not second-class church planters. They're like special ops forces going out into the United States, in the communities today, and getting it done with far fewer resources, which is a much more scalable model. So, yeah, we've got to be really careful not to lift any single modality above another. And Daniel Yang, in his new book, Inalienable, writes about how the church of around the globe is now informing and must inform United States church planting. There it is. Yes. And
I was just chatting with
Daniel.
reading it this week.
It's fantastic. Our executive team's reading it. The Stadia board's reading it. Daniel's a great friend. But my point is that, for instance, with all of our church planting in India or in South America, that's all led by pastors that are co-vocational. And they're just thriving. And so that's informing now so much of the church planting in the United States. Let me ask you this now: digital and phygital. So phygital being a combination of digital and physical plant. Digital being pure digital. What'd your study find out about that modality?
Very little that I can give helpful feedback beyond saying, everybody is doing a blend at some level of in-person with virtual tag teaming. Now, those, of course, that started during the pandemic, many of them started totally virtual, but the vast majority moved to an in-person as soon as law and health would allow. But the exploration of how do we do, like my wife and I just last night were working on an upcoming Bible study in the church we're lay people at. It's a church plant with the Christian Missionary Alliance, a marriage Bible study, and it's going to be part in person and part virtual because we got young marrieds with kids, and so much easier just to put the kids to bed and not have to get a sitter and do many evenings starting at 8:00. So how do you do discipleship? How do you do outreach in ways that become seamless between the in-person and online? And many Edisons are out there trying to figure it out, but everybody's got some kind of play in it.
Warren, I was talking to a dear friend, Pat Gelsinger, who is the CEO of Nettle, and Pat speaks very openly about his investment in church planting via Stadia. They're very generous in church planting. And I was talking, I said, so Pat, it's just a couple of months ago, I said, how much should Stadia be investing in research and development for the future of technology in church planting? And as always, he gave me wise counsel. He said, well, you've got to make sure that you're serving your core customers as you are right now, but invest everything you can in the future of technology and church planting. He said, technology is not going away. It's going to continue. And the most fascinating thing that he told me, he said, the way that the smartphone has changed our lives, he said, within 5 years, virtual reality technology will change our lives just as much. Imagine the implications of that for church planting.
That is incredible. I remember the jokes of the hologram preacher and was he there in person? But at the same time, I remember my first experience when I was writing an article on multi-site churches, and I went to 3 churches that morning, and then I wrote my notes up that afternoon, and I had to think really hard about the first church I visited. Was the pastor there, was the preacher, the teacher, there in person or by video? And I thought, if I can't remember, then it's working. And now the 3D and all this other virtual is going to take us to new realms, indeed.
Hey, Warren, one of the things that I was most surprised by in the report, and I'd love for you to comment on this, was one of the statements is the younger the church planter, the more likely the church is multiracial. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yes. Okay. Let me just say several. The younger the church planter, the more likely to be growing. The younger the church planter, the more likely to have to be a larger size at their particular point in terms of how many years of life. I just was so thrilled by the clear age difference. First, that you had such a wide range of ages doing church planting, and that's in itself delightful. But how the younger crowd was leading the way. But let's go to multiracial in particular. Yes, that younger are more likely to launch with a multiracial team. Younger are more likely to have a spouse of a different race, which immediately opens the door for the kinds of people drawn to the church and ministered to by the church. The younger the person, the more likely the current makeup of the church is to be multiracial. And this is all fascinating. I also did something. I'm going to put on my sociologist hat for just a second. I asked everybody, tell me the zip code that a lot of your people come from. And then I went to U.S. Census data and I said, so how multiracial is that census area? And how does that correlate with whether the church is multiracial or not? And by and large, it doesn't. Yes, in extreme areas where it was solidly one race, the church tended to be solidly one race. But multiracial churches were in the whole spectrum of, as long as there are people of color or people, various races represented, the intentionality of the leadership, of the board, of the platforming, of the different messaging that you can do, says you don't have to match the exact makeup of your community if your community is just one predominant race. And I'll carry it even further. We ask, okay, so of multiracial churches, what race leads them? And we found white, Black, Hispanic, Asian, all lead multiracial churches, and percentage-wise, Blacks are more likely to lead a church identified as multiracial, followed very closely by white, followed by Hispanic, followed by Asian.
I think just one of the most exciting things that's happening now is the raising up what we're watching. And of course, our Black brothers and sisters and Latinos have been amazing at church planting and church over the years. But finally, white culture is starting to listen and learn. And there's this mutual learning from one another that's just beautiful, finally, in the church world. And we need to keep elevating that. Warren, as we kind of wrap up here, and I can't wait to have you on as a guest again. This is because we haven't even unpacked the other surveys yet that I would love to get into. What are you lots of church planners are listening, lots of church leaders, lots of investors in churches and church planting. What would you say to them as we kind of wrap up this episode of the Church Planting Podcast?
So the future of America, of Christianity in America, depends heavily on church planters and church planting. Now, let me just unpack that. First, as Lyle Schaller, one of my mentors, said for years, if a denomination or movement wants to decline, it needs to plant 2% or less of its churches. So let's say it has 100 churches. That means it needs to plant 2 or 1 or none per year. If it wants to hold even, it needs to plant 3 out of 100, 3%. If it wants to grow, it needs to plant 4% or more. And very few denominations are doing that to this day. So much of growth comes back to, are we starting new units? Are we finding areas that people have moved to that are underchurched? Are we finding types of populations that are underreached? But second, it's the church planners that are disproportionately innovative, entrepreneurial, experimenting, let's try decentralizing in this way. Let's try this hybrid approach. Let's try this. And they are going to discover patterns that reach this next generation, and the rest of us are going to learn from it. So, Greg, you referred earlier about Pat Gelsinger and R&D. Really, the R&D is what's happening out on the field, just as much as what a researcher like me through ECFA, the Evangelical Council for Financial Accountability, where a third of our members are into church planting at some level. Yay! And that's overseas and here in North America. But it's the frontline church planter that's going to shape the future, especially as our culture becomes more distinct for what it means to be a Christian.
Warren Bird, ECFA, please head to their website, get these free reports. They're doing amazing work throughout the United States and around the world. Warren, thank you so much for all the work you're doing on behalf of Stadia, me personally, for your friendship. So grateful to you, my friend.
Count me as one of your biggest cheerleaders, Greg.